What's up, friends, and welcome into Fantasy Pros. This is the Fantasy Baseball Podcast. I am Chris Welsh, and today we are talking about the biggest questions in fantasy for 2025. In fact, the 10 biggest questions of 2025. And joining me, of course, is the wonkiest of piglins. It is Kelly Kirby. Kelly, what's up?
Not a whole lot. How are you doing? Well, so we were just talking. We hadn't talked in a really long time. So it's nice to be here with you and talking baseball finally.
That's sad. You're just so busy. And Kelly's just out there just like doing all this stuff in the back end, doing all these crazy things. I get my time with Kelly is usually during baseball season in the leading off chat is where I get to spend the most of my time. But Kelly not only does hockey, kind of does a little bit of everything, clearly does baseball, and also runs a lot of our contests here. So you're going to probably have a lot of questions here for the 2025 season, right?
Yes, I do. Absolutely. For sure. Because 2025 just looks like it's going to be a little bit different on paper than 2024 and certainly 2023. So as I'm writing player notes, I'm just like, I don't really know what to do with this guy. So I'm really excited for you to ask me like on air what I'm going to do with that guy.
Yeah. And a lot of this is going to derive as well from, things that we experienced last year, trends, positional trends, players. So we're going to go through the 10 biggest questions that we are going to answer to best of our ability going into this season. And hopefully that's going to help you guys get through it. And some of these are very player centric as well, too. It's not all theory. If anyone's thinking like, oh, you guys are just going to talk about stolen bases. Like, no, it's not just about that. There are some players that are carrying some very heavy weights around them, as well as the overall picks. So before we get into that, just want to remind you guys to check out everything we have got going on over at Fantasy Pros. Make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/fantasypros.mlb. You can also find the podcast wherever podcasts are. It is a brand new year. We are going to be doing tons of cool prizes. I am already working on some of those as well, whether it's into leading off or the draft season. So make sure you are locked into all the content as well. Make sure you've got it bookmarked over at Fantasy Pros, because my playbook, The Draft Wizard, we did a mock draft episode. All of that is coming to you very soon. So you can go and download the apps and get ready for all the new content, plus ranks and more. Fantasy Pros got you hooked up. Fantasy Pros MLB. All right, let's jump into this. Number one, the top question for the 2025 season. It's pretty easy. Is it? Who is the true number one fantasy player this year? So I think it's appropriate to, talk about the top of the draft. I say this because I think there are 4 quadrants to this, Kelly. There are 4 ways you can look at the number. I guess I should say there is a 5th in there, and I'll tell you what that is. But the 4 quadrants of the type of player that you want. There is A, the all-encompassing, I do everything Shohei Ohtani, except have a position. There's B, the I do everything, does not quite as good as Shohei Ohtani, but I would deserve an MVP, Bobby Witt Jr. There is I want all of the homers in the entire world, Aaron Judge. And there is the I want all the stolen bases in the entire world, with pretty good power and potential number one fantasy player, in Elly De La Cruz. The 5th option, I play points and I want a pitcher. We'll talk about pitchers later here. But really, those are like the 4 quadrants of it. So based on all of those things, you can have everything at shortstop, maybe just not quite at the tippy top. You can have everything without a position. You can have all of the power while doing some other stuff, and you can have all the speed while doing some other stuff. Who is the true number one in fantasy this year?
Well, I would say that for me, the true number one in fantasy this year is the same one that I listed last year, and I just think it's Shohei. And I think it'll be Shohei until future notice for me. I don't know how you look past a 50-50 guy and say, oh no, and then he's going to pitch. Like, oh, what a terrible bonus to have come back in 2025. So for me alone, and I will say I had Bobby Witt ranked number one. I feel like every day I flip them just to see what I'm feeling. But for the purposes of this moment, I would say it's Shohei. Just the things he's able to do, the lineup that he's in, and then especially in the leagues where he's just got the dual eligibility and you can throw him in at pitcher. I don't know how you go against that. That's always my argument, to have a guy who's that good at both. And people are like, oh, but so and so Judge did this better. And I was like, but he didn't pitch. So
Oh, yeah, then you get
there's
into
that.
the MVP
Yeah.
conversation for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's
Right.
interesting, like, with Ohtani, I agree here. I think the answer is Shohei Ohtani, even though he is positionless. The negative is he takes up that util spot that kills a little bit of flexibility, obviously, if you're wanting to throw some other guys in. It kills guys like Marcell Ozuna, if you
Mhm.
wanted Stanton, it kills a couple of those util-only type of players that are floating out there. Um but like the offensive advantage is so extreme. I mean, if
Mhm.
you're telling me I can get 50-50 with a great average and the best lineup, I kind of just don't care about the position. Like that, I think
Mhm.
that's relative. That was an argument. Just I'm going to point this out. I made this last year. I made this argument. I would love, we're not going to do it with the editors here, but I want to pull up the clip of last year where I literally made this argument in draft season last year that who cares if he's positionless with all of
Mhm.
the stats? That's the thing that I know is holding him back for other people. I think there are other arguments. I gave you those four. I think all of them play a role in the like NFBC world. I can see where Ellie is going to get some number ones in there. I mean,
Mhm.
extreme stolen bases in an extreme hitter friendly environment. I see it, especially if he continues to progress. I mean, all of
Mhm.
those things are positives. If you're telling me I can get a 25-75 season out of him, I mean, that's like similar to what we had like with like Ronald Acuna in the previous year was like 40, whatever it was, 40, 60, 40, 70.
Mhm.
Judge, same thing. Maybe even in a points league, there's a little bit more value with the big bopping power. And like I said, Bobby Witt's across that core. I think all four of them play. Some people may be a little less comfortable in the positionless Shohei Ohtani, but at the end of the day, that big question of who is the true number one pick in fantasy, NFBC shows it as Shohei Ohtani, and I think it'll stick
Mhm.
that way. The only thing I'm going to throw out to you, though,
Mhm.
is the pitching side of it. He shouldn't have pitching eligibility this year in any format. So you're probably not going to get I mean, unless they're just going to, this is the tricky thing
Mhm.
unless they're just going to throw at you like, well, he's a dual eligible player, so we're going to give it to him. But technically, based on what you've done the previous year, in theory, he shouldn't have that pitching eligibility at all, and he would have to pitch a certain amount of games to get it. I just don't know if how sites are going to treat that this year, or if they're going to do it. I don't think NFBC has him as a pitcher. Do they have him as a pitcher? Do you know?
I actually don't know
I'm gonna
what
look.
they've got him at. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Um, because I would assume I guess that's an interesting point, but, like, with Yahoo, who split him into 2 players, I would just assume that he's a pitcher, so they would just have him listed as a pitcher, but
They do. They do still have him listed as a
yeah.
pitcher, but I do think it's like an interesting caveat to like
Mhm.
how like position eligibility works. Like the guy played all
Mhm.
last year and he didn't pitch a single game, so they're almost giving him like this extra little benefit. And if he qualifies at two positions, there you go. There's like the extra
Yeah.
benefit for head to head. It's like well, even but like daily transactional leagues. That
Right.
makes Otani
Right.
even better. But those are the big core of who is the number one pick in fantasy. I
Yep.
said somebody's name in here, and this comes to number two on the list of the biggest questions. I said Ronald Acuna. So you say,
Mhm.
why are we not talking about Ronald Acuna on this list? Because it was him at the tippy top. So the question is, should we be afraid of Ronald Acuna and his high cost? Now, he's not in that list because he's coming off of a pretty serious injury. That
Mhm.
injury might have him miss the first month of the season. And he talked about maybe not being as aggressive on the base path. So why is he not in that top conversation? Well, I laid some of that out. But the further question that's pushed is should we be afraid of Ronald Acuna? Because early NFBC drafts, he's going close to the third round. I mean, 15 team leagues, he's going into the 30s, not going in the first,
Mhm.
not going in the second, even though we know the talent is there. He is now stacking some injuries. He's going to miss time and he's going to run less. Should that have us running scared?
I don't know if you need to run scared, but I also can't see taking a second or third round pick on him at this point. Just and I don't know if you've seen an update other than the one that I've seen, which came out like early November, that said that the GM was like, "Well, we're expecting him back early in the season, but it could be as late as June." And I'm like, "Well, that's 2 full months of a guy that you're going to take in the top 3 like rounds." I, is he going to come right off and start running? Is he going to like ease back in? There's just too many questions that I personally would not want to risk it with him this year at that point. if he starts slipping 4th, 5th, 6th round, like, okay, then you might start to consider it, but you still have to bake in not knowing what you're going to get from him when he comes back.
I'm pretty scared, and I think you should be scared
Mhm.
of Ronald Acuna at this point, based off of all of that. Like, him missing really any period of time is scary. We've gone down this road in fantasy. If you've played fantasy for any period of time, you've experienced this where you're like, oh, this guy might be hurt and he'll come back. You know what comes to mind is a basketball one, but it was like 5 or 6 years ago. It's like Kawhi Leonard. Like, Kawhi Leonard was kind of banged up.
Mhm.
Take him like number one overall, and then he missed significant periods of time. It's happened with football. It's kind of happened across the board. So taking on injury risk is very scary. Plus the word. So I think it immediately eliminates him from first round. It immediately eliminates him from second round. In 15-team roto, you can probably start to consider it, but I am probably still fading. I don't have a ton of interest. If it was a 10 and 12 team, maybe a head to head where if I have him full force in going into a playoff, I might be more interested. But I think you should be scared, especially if the price gets pushed up because of his name. Projections, we have steamer projections out there, according to Fangraphs, have him playing 131 games, 26 homers, and 43 stolen bases. Let's start here. Over under 131 games.
I'm going to go under. I think
Over
120 is probably a little bit better.
over or under 43, I'm sorry, 46 stolen bases, because that's what Steamer has him.
Ugh. See, I'm going to go the under, but that one is trickier because I think if he's going to run like a lot, right? But who knows with the D?
I'm going to go under on both of them. I'm going to go under on
Mhm.
games. I'm going to go under on stolen bases. He's literally, I mean, I know he wants to run, but I think he
Mhm.
had openly talked about, I might need to run less. I mean, this is worrisome. This is a knee injury. They can't
Mhm.
afford to lose him again. I don't think that offense needs to be as hyper aggressive as far as
Mhm.
him running. You want him to do it, but I think you might be looking closer into a 20 to 25 range. And I
Mhm.
clearly know he can hit for huge power. Guy hit 41 homers. Maybe that taps back. 30-20 would be
Mhm.
phenomenal if you can get that
Mhm.
out of Acuna, but there is mass injury risk. You don't know how long it's going to go. So I think the answer to the question is, should you be afraid of the high cost of Acuna? Yes, you should be,
Mhm.
because I don't know what the platforms are going to drop on Acuna's early ranks and where he's going to be sitting. But based off of that projection, if that projection is what people are going with, almost 30 homers and almost 50 stolen bases, they're going to have him ranked
Mhm.
in the top 15. I think it's
Mhm.
too much injury risk at this moment. If we get some great news where they say he's 100% coming back before May, okay, that changes the perspective. But I still think the
Mhm.
stolen bases are going to go down a little bit. So I think that is the answer to that one. Number 3, let's go into the pitching market. I mentioned if you're in a points league, maybe the number one guy you would want to take is a pitcher. So how about, who is that number one pitcher? And the question is Paul Skenes the number one starting pitcher in fantasy?
And as you saw in the show sheet, I really, really dedicated myself to answering this one by saying maybe, but I would take Skubal. So I think Skeens is unbelievable. I think he is on paper he's absolutely the SP1. I know that you love him, so I'm trying not to disparage him in any way. Um, I just wonder in terms of like innings if and in Pittsburgh, and he throws so hard that I I have just enough concern that I kinda wanna see another year from him before I buy all the way in, but I I have no advice to say don't take him. I just would prefer Skubal.
The thing I wish I would have done here, this would have been really good show planning, is go back and look and see like the performance of the number one fantasy pitcher year after year and where the finishes actually are and where they're going.
Mm,
Like, yeah, I mean, like, who was the number one this year? Wasn't it Burns? I think Skubal was high up on that list, I think, which plays really well. I know Burns was high up that list.
yeah. Well, I thought Sale was up there too, wasn't he?
No, Sale was pretty low. Sale was like
Was
outside the
he?
top 100. Sale was one of the most beneficial pitchers to this
Okay.
season. I know Reagan's went really high. It's kind of moved around. This is
Oh,
a,
okay. No, I'm sorry.
this is a tough question. This is a tough
Mhm,
question. Is Skeens the number one guy? From a stuff perspective of what Paul Skeens did, it's ridiculous. He had a 33% K percentage with only a 6% walk rate. Nuts. Pulled up
mhm,
130 innings, which very likely could push him to 170. an under 2 ERA with a 2.5 expected ERA, which was phenomenal. He was elite across the board. Four-seam fastball was one of the best strikeout pitches, 37%, and his splinker ended up having like an over 20%. I mean, he developed these great pitches to keep everybody off. His stuff is elite, but like so is Skubal's. And my difficulty with this is you also have a 2 ERA, you also have a 30% K percentage, a better walk rate. He was up year over year on his fastball. His changeup had a 34% K percentage, which was crazy. And, you know, I think the floor on him, based off of maybe some of the concerns that sit out there as far as like Skenes and arm and usage, could anything happen, are something relevant to be out there. But I think either one of these work. So is Skenes the number one? Yes. Can you justify going Skubal over? Yes. Can you go anybody else? No. But I think just from a pure strikeout standpoint, if you were to give me 200 innings on Paul Skenes versus 200 innings on Skubal, I mean, do you think there's still, I mean, I guess how am I trying to say this? If you give me 200, if you were promised 200 innings on Paul Skenes and no injury, would he be the flat out guaranteed number one starting pitcher for you?
Yes, without any question.
Okay. So then there is like a little bit of a question that floats out there for you.
Yes, very much so. I mean, I think it's the innings, it's what are they going to do with him? And it's Pittsburgh. Sorry, I always just kind of like, I don't know if they're going to shut him down for no reason, or, you know, I don't trust them, I guess is the thing. But if you guaranteed me 200 innings, then yeah, I would take him over Skubal, even though I love Skubal.
Steamer says 188 innings this year projected off of his 133. Seems like that's a possibility. Still a 2.5 ERA and almost 250 strikeouts this year. So pitchers are all risky. And that's why I would say, if you want to talk about, you know, is he the number one? Yes, he's the number one. But who you want is another question. And that comes to question number 4. This is kind of a two-parter. A, is pocket aces and then / high-end drafting of starting pitching dead? And I know that's difficult because, like, we just talked about Paul Skenes and Skubal. What's so great is they feel confirmed. Like, you know, we had like the Garrett Cole injuries and stuff like that. Whether it's Skenes number one or Skubal number one, it's those two. And then there's a gap in everybody else. And I think that is what is uniquely different than maybe prior years. There is no question about what that elite looks like. But is that elite dead in investing high into starting pitching? And then the second question is like, would you pocket ace it Skubal and Skenes this year?
I personally would have no problem pocket acing the two of them together for the sheer joy of having both of them on my team, and then just chasing, not necessarily punting power per se, but kind of chasing the like 4 other categories for the hitters versus just home runs. I promise I will do it in one league. Like, I can guarantee you that I will do it in one league. I think and for me, I think the big thing is always like, is it a strategy that no one else is using? And if it's a strategy no one else is using, then it becomes viable. And if everyone on earth is like, you can't do pocket aces, like, it might be worth trying, because then you've taken the 2 off the board and everyone else has to start scrambling for starters, and you can get a lot of those like 3rd, 4th, 5th round guys that have a lot of value on their own. They're just not those top 5 we talked about before. So yeah, if I have a late round pick in first round, like if I'm in the 10, 11, 12, I would think about it. Just doubling up.
Yeah, I like the idea of like pocket aces is viable with those two. I think the bigger question is pocket aces viable if you can only get one of them? And then it feels like, no, pocket aces exist. It's pocket Skubal and Skenes. That's it. It's pocket S's. If you can get those. Outside of that, I'm not sure I want to jump. And I think that comes back to maybe what the bigger part of this question is like, is high-end drafting kind of dead? Well, going through this, Zach Wheeler's kind of held some value. Gilbert, for the most part, Gilbert obviously has moved up, but like he was drafted kind of high. Garrett Cole is still in this range, which feels pretty nice. But let's run through some of this. Cole Reagans did not live up. He's actually ranked, I think, lower this year than where he was being ranked prior to that. George Kirby was a massive disappointment this year. He had no progression whatsoever, he didn't walk people. Pablo Lopez, huge disappointment. The injury with Yamamoto was a big disappointment. There's Luis Castillo fell apart. A lot of that high-end pitching failed you. But look at some of the players that are now being drafted super high and where they were drafted compared to last year. Garrett Crochet, an absolute freebie. Chris Sale, who we mentioned, Cy Young winner, was being drafted outside the overall top 100. Blake Snell, horrific start, incredible into the season. And then you can throw on like a guy like Michael King, who was my favorite from last year. Michael King had a starter's workload. It was incredible. So it maybe exists around, you can't every year be like, oh, well, there's just by math, there's going to be like, 7 guys that are going to jump up from outside the top 30 up. No, you can't necessarily just prove and say that, but it is the identification and the value differences on the pitching. There is still inherent risk. Garrett Crochet going to maybe a little bit more of a hitter environment with injury concerns that are always floating out there. Even though I love him, there's that. Corbin Burns signs with the Arizona Diamondbacks. Concerns maybe just in general also is like, I mean, the stuff was still great, but like he took a back seat to last year. And being able to identify what is the difference between, let's say, a Cole Reagans and then coming down to a Hunter Green. And Hunter Green is just an example of a pitcher that's being probably ranked outside the top 20 overall. And Hunter Green had like an absolutely ridiculous season if you really look at it. 2.75 ERA, fastball and slider both held hitters to under 200. He added a splitter, which changed his game. He had a 3.34 ERA in the first half, a 1 ERA in the second half. So that's like my main point. There's these incredible values that are still later, but we fool ourselves into thinking these high top 10 pitchers are chalk and we're guaranteed and everything is safe. It's not, because I would probably argue that half, if not maybe one more of the top 10 from last year did not even come close to recouping or failed in overall value. So that's a lot that I threw out there. So I would say high-end SP drafting kind of is it's not dead because it is a pivot play, but I'm not going to do the high-end drafting, but I would mess around a little bit with those pocket S's.
Yes. Yep, I agree with you entirely. And I think as long as you feel confident that you're able to identify the pitchers that are going to may probably outperform. If you feel like evaluating pitching is not your strength in fantasy drafting, I think it's okay to take a couple of the ones that maybe have the most like veteran status, seem to be the most consistent with that, like a higher floor than most people, with the ability to maybe go 200 innings or something along those lines. It's just, if you're good at finding it later, then by all means ignore it. But no, there will be no way that I could avoid drafting the two of them in at least one league. So
yeah, and I think it's actually good that you said that too. One thing I want to add to that is like high-end drafting doesn't mean you can't take one. But I think the high-end SP drafting is where someone's like, well, I'm taking an SP in the second round. I'm taking them in the fourth round. I'm going to take them in the seventh round. And then maybe the ninth. And I've taken, maybe top 8 picks. You've taken half of those as starting pitchers. I think that's what we're talking about. Doesn't mean it won't work. You could hit on the right guys. But I think I would probably push more for, higher comboed players that, provide good batting average with power and speed, then higher home run chasing before I start going nuts. But, maybe if you're going to give me Chris Sale in the third round, I'm going to take one Chris Sale and then I'll wait a while and maybe I'll jump in and take, a discounted Pablo Lopez. And then I will, dip into the outside the top 100s and give me, the Joe Ryans, the Hunter Browns of the world, the Zach Allens, like that, innings eaters. That would be more of my play than in a heavy investment. All right. We got more coming up here, but first, the futures market's going to be opening up soon. You're going to get the team totals, which is going to be super exciting. You're going to get MVP, Rookie of the Year. You're going to start getting all the incredible, like this guy is going to hit more than this home runs. Last year, my best bet of the season was I put a 6-1, a 6.5-1, to be specific, on Ellie De La Cruz to lead the league in stolen bases. That was a huge, big win for me. You have a chance to start stocking up and doing your work with Betting Pros. You can download the Betting Pros app today. Now, here's the offer, though, because Betting Pros is free. You can download the app, iOS, Android. You can follow some of your favorite Betting Pros people. You can check out the great feed we have. People are putting their picks in, but the offer is you can unlock a full month free of Betting Pros Premium by using promo code SP free. Because baseball's not here. There's plenty of other sports, but baseball will be here. We got same game parlay tools, prop bet analyzer, prize pick, prop bet cheat sheet. I'll be pressing our boys. We were working on a Nerfy cheat sheet from last season. Lots of great stuff, but you can start testing and playing around with your betting today and get ready for the baseball season with Betting Pros. Download the app and use code FP free. All right, let's jump into number 5 here. Are Corbin Carroll and Julio Rodriguez fantasy busts? Now, this is why I asked this question, because last year they were fantasy busts. This year, you get almost no discount. They're back. It's crazy. Corbin Carroll probably going top 4, Julio, essentially both of them like top 5 last season. Both did not return and recoup value. Corbin Carroll definitely saved it with a huge second half of big power output, did not steal the same amount of bases, but he still got there. Julio Rodriguez was just okay, was fine. It was not what we expected. There was no growth. There was a step back. So by virtue of their cost to last year, you can just say what I paid and what I got, that was kind of bust-ish. But the question is, they are back with first round values. Both of these players are, for the most part, going inside of the top 15. So are Corbin Carroll and Julio Rodriguez going to bust in 2025?
I said no on the sheet, and I don't know if it's because I was filling it out at like 1 a.m. or something, but because now when I think about it, I'm like, I don't know about Julio. But calling them bust just seems like a really big word for their age. With Carroll's just being like, we talked about the sophomore slump, which may not be real, but he certainly did not look like himself. I think he dealt with some injuries. So I can see him retaining some of the value, first round value. I don't see on him. With Julio, like you said, it's that lack of growth. It was the lack of he wasn't more selective in his hitting approach. He wasn't stealing the bases as fast because he wasn't getting on base as much. He still plays in just an absolute hitter's nightmare of a ballpark. So I think I would rather have Carroll. I wouldn't call either one of them busts, but I also am not drafting either one of them in the first round. So that I don't know how we're defining bust, but that's where I would be with them.
Well, that's maybe a better question is drafting Carroll or Julio Rodriguez in the first round going to be a failure? And it sounds like you are. I'll screw around a little bit, and I kind of like the idea of you could maybe potentially get them on the wheel and you could take both, but I think taking both of them together might be more inherent risk than you end up wanting. But you seem to be very against either one of them as first round picks, even though Carroll's a 50 home run potential player, but his batting average sunk so dramatically. And like, you're banking on him being able to bring back that batting average and whatever shoulder thing people keep bringing upon them. Julio didn't become average, but he definitely wasn't that special player that we saw before. So drafting him in the first round, that's a bust.
Yes, I think so. And I always warn everyone with the Julio thing that even you can't judge him based on April ever. Like, he's just awful in the first month of the season. So if you draft him, like, you can't decide if you made a very bad decision until at least May, if not June. But no, I just don't see. There are so many other players in that area that I'm more interested in, and I would rather take the risk on someone with upside a few rounds later than try to stack the two of them. And if they both hit, that's great. I feel like Carroll has a much higher chance of hitting in first round value than Julio at this point.
Yeah, I'm going to say taking them together feels like there's some bust, but I just still think there's just big upside. I think there are safer players. I like the idea of taking one of them. Probably no shocker, I'm going to go on the side of Carroll. I think the stolen bases, they're just still so elite. I kind of like the idea of like Josh Naylor being on that team and them not losing this big RBI potential. There was this, God, I wish I had the stat here. It was the average players getting on base and their percentage of scoring. I don't know if you saw this stat that was sitting out there. It was, follow me here. I'm completely going to butcher it, but it was something along the lines of like, the MLB average of a player gets on base and scores, let's call it was like 25% or 30%. And this was a Corbin Carroll thing. Corbin Carroll was like 50% of the time or 60% of the time he got on base, he was scoring. He's an elite runs guy. He's an elite stolen base guy. RBIs, they can get there. the power, he obviously was able to bring back whatever people were determining. You know, I spent so much time last year talking about the way he was being pitched. He obviously was up and inside. You could look at his chart from the year before, see that's where he struggled and he got demolished. Then, you know, he just kept chasing it. And he openly talked about, by the way, Corbin Carroll said the way he wants to get through things is work through them, like literally just attack and just keep going until he and hit through it. It was the word. And it didn't really work until the end where he showed back that power. So I think there's huge upside and both of them are not busts, and taking one of them actually has great return and is something I'd want to do, but taking both of them has some bust potential. Corbin Carroll, we love stolen bases. Should we continue loving stolen bases? Number 6, are stolen base or is stolen base chasing a thing of the past?
And I wrote on there that I think, yes, if you're talking about a player like Esteury Ruiz, right, that he's a one-trick guy, and his one trick is stolen bases. And I don't think that chasing that, especially early in the draft of any kind, is worth it at this point, because there are so many guys that are going to, once you add them all together, you're gonna get there. If you do want to chase stolen bases, then just draft Ellie and call it a day, and then worry about picking up some more later in the draft. But I personally think it's a thing of the past, because it's a category that, especially like in a head-to-head weekly league, like you don't need that much most of the time to win it. And so if you draft one guy who's got that really elite speed, of Carroll or an Ellie or a Bobby, like you should be good for the most part. So no, I'm not. If that's a player's only strength, I'm not going anywhere near him.
49 players last year stole 20 or more bases that had at least 150 at bats. 49 of those players, 31 had 25 or more stolen bases. I'm not doing the math here of the like 10 plus homers, but like those guys are there. I mean, look at a guy like Luis Garcia with the Nationals. He was almost a 2020 guy. You ended up having Jeremy Pena, who was 15-20. I mean, you can find cheaper stolen bases. Luis Rengifo is one of those players that, you know, he's kind of got one side where he's a power bat. He was kind of retransforming himself to be contact and stole a massive amount of bases. Michael Ciani had 20 stolen bases. So yeah, I think having to chase stolen bases is a thing of the past. Now, finding quality stolen bases, I think that should be what the new conversation of the stolen base chase is, yeah, you're right. Like Ellie is hey, you get Ellie, you can maybe set it and forget it. You could take a Bryce Terang, you know, who had 50 stolen bases last year, if you have really not focused. But that's the key here. It's like Bryce Terang is not a high commodity. You could take Rafael Devers of the world. You know, you could take the Vladimir Guerreros. You could take you know, whatever power outfielder, Jordan Alvarez. You could take those and you can be like, man, I don't have a lot of stolen bases. The problem is the positive is you can get Terang, who's cheap and has tons of stolen bases, but pairing them with significant homers, that's where things get lost. And that's kind of been my motto of stolen base chasing, is I want quality stolen bases. And that is where Carroll is a 20 stolen base guy with 30 plus stolen bases with 20 plus home run power. Jarren Duran, 20, 30. Jackson Merrill, like those, obviously Bobby Witt. Those are the quality stolen bases. So I think you want to chase quality stolen bases. But if you want to go heavy floor power bats, the Devers, the Rileys, the Alvarezes, the Vlads, and you want to just keep pairing those players as you go, you can find later rounds of Lane Thomas, who had 30 plus stolen bases. Dylan Moore, his batting average will sink you, but he had 10 homers and 32 stolen bases. Stott, I mean, I have 23 players of 30 or more stolen bases. So yeah, chasing stolen bases is kind of dead, because you can find it everywhere, Kelly.
Yeah, and Mayer and I talked about this a lot in September, where Victor Robles was like winning us. Like, you picked him up off the waivers at the beginning of September, and he was just like clearing the stolen base category for me in head-to-head leagues. Like, I don't remember who went down, but I needed someone who might steal, and you know, he just turned around and batted like 383 and stole like 7 or 8 bases a week. And it was just like if it's that easy and you don't have to chase it on draft day, then I don't see the point in doing it. So yeah, I think it's the one you can certainly wait on much longer than the other 9 categories.
Yeah, and it's retransforming it in your brain. Stop chasing stolen bases and chase quality stolen bases. Those are high average, higher power. Getting two
Mhm.
of those players, I think, is paramount. So that's why if you got like the Julio and Carroll, it's like, okay, that kind of fits that. You might be deficient in batting average, but like that, those are the type of things I'm looking at. Or starting with a Jose Ramirez, and then coming in later with a Lawrence Butler or a Brenton Doyle or something like that. Like those are more quality homer and stolen base. Even though I don't like Doyle this year, bad home run splits and stuff. But like those are the higher
Mhm.
quality stolen bases. That's what I want to chase. Number 7. Speaking of Lawrence Butler was a rookie that paid off pretty well. He was not a rookie that anybody was drafting and people were picking up. Frankly, he was so good to start, and then he tanked. People dropped him, and he came back
Mhm.
up. I remember bringing Pia back on at the end of the season on leading off, when he leaves. And he was like,
Mhm.
Lawrence Butler's still a thing? I'm like, oh, yeah, buddy. When you left, he was tanking, and then he came back up, and he was incredible. That's a rookie that
Mhm.
really benefited. But there are a lot of rookies that their costs can be tough. Wyatt Langford, high cost, early struggles. People got frustrated, and then he bounced back. Jackson Churio was fine, kind of slowed, blah, blah, blah. Then you get guys like Jackson Merrill, who were low cost, high return. The question is, should you trust drafting rookies? And specifically, it's centered around the higher cost. This year, that is James Wood. That is Jason Dominguez. That is Dylan Cruz. I mean, Paul Skenes was going high-ish last year for not having any spot, and obviously it ended up being a big payoff. But all three of those guys, those are like the top 100 to 125 players. And all we are is a couple announcements away from Roman Anthony being a player
Mhm.
that's going to be popping up. Jackson Jobe would be another one of those. Should we be comfortable trusting the high cost rookies?
No, under no circumstances. I think, eh, there were some the can't miss guys, like when Witt came up a couple years ago, like, yeah, that one made a lot of sense to me. Go ahead, chase it. Y But even he struggled when he got up. So I think I sort of have a rule where I'm like, if there's one I really want, I will target that one, I will draft him, but I'm not gonna draft 2, I'm not gonna draft 7. I have a really hard time trusting him. The problem, of course, is, like, psychologically, everybody wants the upside and everybody wants the youth, and nobody wants the proven, like, draft the boring veterans and win your league, because it's just not as fun. So, yeah, I mean, of that group that you just said, I'm like, yeah, I would draft one strictly for the upside, but I would also draft them expecting nothing. So, in terms of trust, I no, to me, it's just a total risk. But I know that you are much more on this. So, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm a little bit on the opposite end, and here's the only reason is because I feel like the cost is cheaper than
Hmm.
it's been in past, and I think that is because of feeling jaded. I think people that maybe faded at the end might have a little disdain for Wyatt Langford, even though like he ended solid. Projections are phenomenal. Churio really bounced back. I don't think it was ever like horrific or anything for anybody. But I think people look at Corbin Carroll and Julio Rodriguez and see these kind of sophomore type of slumps. They see how long it took for returns on some of these players to really, really make sense. And I think people feel jaded in that. And I think in turn, that has made the cost be cheaper. I mean, James
Hmm.
Wood is probably your most expensive, but then Dylan Cruz and Jason Dominguez, I want to say Dominguez is going outside of like the top 100. Jackson Jobe, projections are in the 130 marker as far as innings. I think pitchers are kind of dicey. I don't think there's a Paul Skenes that's out there, but they're kind of free. And then there's some other sneaky ones. I mean,
Hmm.
Jordan Lawler is going to be out
Hmm.
there, and he might have a gig this year. There are some sneaky ones. So I actually think you shouldn't have heavy investment, but like my approach is the same but different than yours. I actually think you should have one. I think you should play that upside because the cost is cheap, but you shouldn't get too highly invested. I don't want to have like James Wood, Jason Dominguez, and Jackson Jobe and be like, let's go. That's not the
Hmm.
play in redraft. The lower the investment, the better. And I think James Wood is the most exciting and probably the one I'd obviously want to invest in. But I think I'll have more shares of Dylan Cruz and Jason Dominguez simply because they are going to be at a cost where their upside is so great. And those are 2020 bats. Those are all
Hmm.
guys that can go 2020. Dylan Cruz maybe even safer in that. So I think there's a floorness to the popular rookies now that there wasn't last year. So I will say you can trust some type of investment because it's just so much cheaper, which is nice.
For sure. And is now the time we start warning people about the guy that comes out of spring training, like that everyone's drafting 5 rounds too early? Like maybe don't do that this year, based on
It's
the
gonna
Jordan
be.
Walkers and the Wyatt Langfords, and like there's going to be one that lights it up. You have to be careful not to draft based on that
I
entirely. So
I think that player is Roman Anthony.
okay,
If they if they
I
announce, if the Red Sox give him a spot, I'm gonna be tempted. But Roman
mhm,
Anthony, I mean, just great power speed combo. It's an insane bat. He's skyrocketed up ranks. People look at the Red Sox roster and they want to start projecting. If they don't fill out one of those spots and Roman Anthony starts hitting pretty well, Roman Anthony will be a player that goes from outside the top 300 to inside the top 100. But like, his value is going to be super sexy, but I think he would hit at the bottom of the lineup. That would be the one, the Jordan
mhm,
Walker-esque, I would be a little bit scared. In redraft, I would. So that
mhm.
we'll put a pin in that one, which is, it's a good
Okay.
question.
And Roman Anthony was the one I also thought of where I'm like,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
yeah, I was like, oh, he's the one this year. So yeah.
But I mean, to the point too, like maybe it would be Jason Dominguez. Like maybe he
Mhm.
flies up, but I think his value is already just there. People assume he
Yeah.
has the gig. Same thing with Dylan Cruz, and they're not boosting
Mhm.
up too crazy. Dylan Cruz, I might, more as I keep talking through, it might be my favorite of all of them because I think he can hit higher in the lineup. He's
Mhm.
cheaper than James Wood. Jason Dominguez, they might hit lower in the lineup. So, just some potential. And the
Mhm.
stolen bases are pretty great. All right, we got three more of the biggest questions. Number 8, should you spend a high pick on a closer? NFBC early ADPs kind of mess that up for a lot of people. You're going to see mock drafts that are going to be based off of some of what they do. People ranking might be off of that. And NFBC props up multiple things: stolen base guys, upside, catchers, and closers. Closers get pushed up. We saw plenty of guys not return their value. We saw tons of guys create new value. We've got big questions in here. So, because of those questions, should you get exactly what you know in a closer that doesn't have volatility, Hader, Clase, Devin Williams, or should you fade going heavy into closers early because of the volatility and the cheap saves you can get later?
This is one of those that, much like the starting pitcher we were talking about before, that I don't mind. I typically don't draft a closer high, but if there is one, if there's nothing else I particularly like in a round, instead of going down to like what I might have looked at for the round after, I might take a Class A, or I might take Devin Williams, who I think that's a really interesting guy in New York. Um, so I'm not against it, but I'm certainly, if there's anyone else that I like, I have no problem fading the closer until like even double digit rounds, and then just start looking at them because there's so much volatility every single year. And sometimes, Hater, I had Hater last year in a lot of leagues, and it wasn't fun some days. like and he was, one of the guaranteed ones. So it's a hard position, and you have to just decide if that's what you want to invest in. But I will, if there just seems to be kind of a little dead zone and there's one of the top guys out there.
I think my answer is no. I think everything you said makes sense. I think the cost of the specifically the ones I mentioned, Class A, Devin Williams, it's going to be so high because people want that assuredness that I don't want to pay that premium. The middle guys, if they get pushed up, I'm not super interested. You have to compete, especially if you're in roto. You can't punt. I mean, you can punt maybe head to head, but I just think, I mean, like we felt Paul Sewald was like, it was a great middle pick
Mhm.
last year. And then it ends
Mhm.
up, it's like, it's Justin Martinez and it's AJ Puck. It's a million different players. So I think you can stream. And I think also we are seeing more. I've said this over a couple last couple of years that closers are becoming more of the running back of fantasy in that teams don't want just one. They want
Mhm.
multiple. They want multiple guys, and they have the fireman who can take the high leverage, or then they have the other guy. I think a team like the Diamondbacks right now look like it would be Martinez and AJ Puck. There are multiple teams that are going to implement this. So I would go cheap. I would not have a high, heavy investment on a closer right now, even though it is exponentially safer. Number 9
Mhm.
on the list: is batting average the biggest statistical advantage to draft? That used to be stolen bases. Everyone chased stolen
Mhm.
bases because if I get ahead, boom. It's kind of power right now. Power
Mhm.
doesn't feel it's at the premium, and you can get some 30 plus homer guys late that you want to build and build and build on power. But over the last couple of years, with great power comes bad batting average responsibility. And that's the
Mhm.
problem here. Batting average does sink. It killed me the last 2 years. I've done a really poor job at it, and I'm trying to find a way to push back on it. So, do you think when you're talking about your pivot game, the pivot is to pivot into batting average as a statistical advantage that people are just failing at?
And I say yes on this one, and I'm actually following, Pat Fitzmaurice that we work with. He every year he writes, something about drafting, like his draft day philosophy, and he talks about, uh, having a high batting average creates, like, the opportunity for those other things, like, if you wanna win the runs category, it really helps if they're on base. It's I for the last couple of years, I've kind of done the, Kyle Schwarber, Luis Rise combo, like, I'll take the power and no average and then later I'll get the guy who might win the batting title. So it's I think it's definitely worth targeting at the expense of power. That's a no because the power still covers at least two categories, if not three. But if I have the choice later in the rounds and I have a guy who might bat 275, 280, I'm going to take him just to kind of boost that average just a little bit.
And I think what that lives in too, I read that as like, when I'm talking about the statistical advantage, is a guy like Devers, a guy like a big
Mhm.
power bat that can hit for where I'm going for stolen bases, give me power. Big power bats give me good batting average where I can, and that's an
Mhm.
advantage. That's something that Vladimir Guerrero, it's not a comparative this year, but people would do the like Vlad versus Alonso, or someone might be like, why would I take Vlad in the second round when I can get Alonso in the fourth? And be like, well, because batting average. That's a
Right.
big difference there. So I think we can get lost with a lot of these toolsy players. I think that chase of rookies and upside sometimes we will also falter with batting average kind of stinking a bit. So I do think the batting average is a statistical advantage, paying attention to what stats you're also chasing. So if you're chasing, I want more power guys because I know I can get stolen bases later, make sure that you are targeting definitively those guys with high batting averages. That's what I would be looking for. Bryce Terang is a really great stolen base chase. Is 254 batting average, is that okay for you? That might be solid in
Mhm.
that chase, knowing that like guys, like there's the Mike Sianis or Dylan Moore would be one of those players. That is solid. But is it worth paying attention more early on to a guy like Jaron Duran, who stole over 30 bases, hit over 20, and hit 285? Like those are the things that I'm talking about. So paying attention to batting average is a statistical advantage. And number 10, it's kind of the question. I mean, we're putting out the question, but we're asking the question with a question. What can you not afford to do again this year on your fantasy team?
My first answer is draft Ronald Acuna because I had him in like 2 or 3 different leagues last year, and, in one I've never won my home league, and I was in the final, and I just couldn't quite get there, and all I could think was I was like, if I had drafted pretty much anyone else in the first round, I probably would have been okay. So that's, like, my joke
But is
answer, but
that
I thi
Acuna or is that an injury? I mean, not that you would have
Right,
known, but was it more about injury? Because I don't know. Like, I get what you're saying
yeah,
here. Acuna was safe. Like Acuna, it was
yeah,
like, hey, great. Acuna did all this. Like, it's just like getting screwed by injury, which you have no
yep.
control of.
Right. So I mean, that was more of my joke answer, I think, just because I was like, I can't risk it this year. But yeah, I mean, I every year you have people just like you have pundits constantly saying, "Don't worry about injury. Everyone can get injured. Don't worry about injury." And I'm like, but we know there are some guys who are much bigger risk. And so for me, it's I think I went with that last year. I've drafted Trout. I drafted Buxton because their value was so great. And I'm like, and then it just went exactly how I knew it was gonna go, and so for me, it's if there's somebody that's just so injury prone who exists, I'm gonna avoid them this year, and I mean, I'm sure I'll lose some other players, but it's just not worth it to me. Even I'm just taking it's baseball. I'm taking it into consideration at this point.
Yeah, it's a good point. Mine is kind of in the same realm because I did similar things. I didn't have a lot of Buxtons, but you know me. Had a Trout here or there. You know me. When my biggest crutch in fantasy is a player, regardless of their injury history, that is an elite of elite talent when they're out there. So Jacob DeGrom has always been a crutch for me. Trout, like he was like killing it before he got hurt. Those are when a guy is like subpar. See, now I'm out on Buxton because now his performance is like even more subpar when he's out there. But when they're out there and they're elite, that's the tough thing. There are new players. I think Acuna now belongs kind of in this injury prone range. But not only was what happened to you, happened to all of us, injuries killed us. And you can say avoid injuries. Mine is pay closer attention to my depth. Because what I did specifically in NFBC this year that really screwed me is I built these really strong teams. Some were risky, some were not. And then on the bench, I played nothing but upside. I just played all the prospect here when he gets there. And then what ends up happening is when I started having bad injuries and losing players, I was screwed. I didn't have the depth of players that could jump back up in best balls or like draft champions that could end up jumping back up. And the same kind of inherent thing ended up happening in more of those standard leagues. Being smaller, I was able to kind of pick up. But in those, the next caveat would be you can't afford to be complacent on the wire. That would be the other thing I would throw to you guys as a existential, maybe speaking for the audience, is injuries, yes. Depth, yes. Don't be complacent on the wire early on and make some aggressive moves because you might have missed out on Skenes. You might have missed out on Lawrence Butler if you were standing on your laurels. So be more hyper diligent and aggressive on the wire. And I think that would be the bigger thing that I could probably give as a piece of advice for everybody this year.
Yeah, and I agree with both of those, I think. Although don't be so aggressive that you like pick up Seth Beer the day after opening day when he hits 3 home runs or whatever. You don't have to be that
I was
aggressive.
at that game, though. I was at that game.
I know you were.
Find it. I have a video. It's actually the most exciting game I've been to outside of, I went to a couple World Series games. It was one of the greatest games I've ever been to. It was National Beer Day. He hit a walk-off shot on my Twitter. You can find the video. It might not be, it's not safe for work or anything like that because Seth Beer hit a homer on National Beer Day on opening day for the Diamondbacks, but I get your point.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring it up because I like to bring it up for you. But otherwise, no, everything you said is pretty prudent. So
yeah, we probably can't clip that video into this by any means or anything like that. But there you go. Those are the 10 biggest fantasy questions for 2025 on our minds. But if you guys have got some other big ones, maybe we can answer them or other people can answer them in the comments below on the YouTube side. So feel free to drop your biggest fantasy questions for the season that maybe need to be answered, or maybe you have answered some of those biggest questions. We love to hear from you guys. You guys also, speaking of hearing from you, can check out our Discord. We've got a free Discord, fantasypros.com/chat. You can sign up today. We've got access to different baseball rooms that are out there completely free. Last year, we also did a live show called Cleaning Up. It's coming back again this year, where you and the studio audience get to come and hang out with us, ask us questions, and it gets on a podcast. We might have more offerings of those, and it's free. Plus, we also have a premium side. So we got a lot of free offerings, but we do the home run contest that Kelly manages. We got the home run contest this year. We've got mock draft rooms. We've got private AMAs and tons more. So whether you want free or you want everything, fantasypros.com/chat, you can go and check us out today. We'd love to see you because the season's going to be here. Next thing you know it. Make sure you've downloaded the My Playbook and the Draft Wizard app. Get ahead of that. Plus, rankings are already getting curated on the site. Kelly and I both have ours there. We'll have more experts as well. And when we open up the draft rooms, you guys are going to be rocking. Kelly, thanks so much for hanging with me on these biggest questions.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
For the Wonky Penguin, I am the Welsh, and we'll talk to you next time right here on Fantasy Pros MLB.